Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm going to give you all a chance to connect to audio while I'm speaking a bit here. Come on in. Come on in, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Looks like we have one or two more coming in. All right, why don't we get started? So welcome everyone to this first Friday lecture for the month of April 2025. Our speaker today will be basic program instructor David Shiner. David's lecture is entitled The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. The first Friday lecture series is supported by the Anastopoulos Lecture Series Fund in memory of basic program instructor George Anastopoulos. My name is Noah Shafitz. I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the basic program. Please note that this presentation is being recorded so that we can make it available on the Graham School YouTube channel. During the lecture and during the question and answer period that will follow, you will not be able to unmute your microphones, but we invite you to enter questions for David in the chat box at any time during today's event. David is going to have a chance to respond to your questions after his lecture. I will put them into a Word document, sort them out, and put them to David after his lecture. So please enter them into the chat at any time. During the lecture, David and I will be able to see only a handful of your video feeds. So you may choose to leave your video on or turn it off at your preference. David's video is going to be spotlighted, so the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Before I give David a full introduction, let me tell you a little bit about the basic program and the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Chicago. So along with the basic program, the Graham School offers an array of programming across the liberal arts, including our Masters of Liberal Arts program and our open enrollment courses, as well as a number of events and travel study opportunities. Since 1946, the basic program has provided our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum dedicated to direct engagement with original texts. At the heart of the basic program is our 4-year course sequence, which offers firsthand encounters with some of the greatest works of the classical and Western traditions in a community of adult learners and in courses led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Registration for the summer quarter is ongoing, and our sections have a tendency to fill up quickly, so I recommend that you reserve your spots as soon as you can if you haven't done so already. Registration for the autumn will open quite soon, so please keep checking our website for details. Our next First Friday lecture will take place on May 2nd. Our speaker then will be basic program instructor Claire Pearson, and the title of her lecture will be Dostoevsky and the Problem of Evil. Today's speaker, David Shiner, is professor emeritus at Shimer College, now the Shimer Great Book School at North Central College, where he taught for 40 years and served several terms as dean of the college. At Shimer, Professor Shiner taught all 16 required courses on subjects as distinct as literature, chemistry, psychology, and politics. He has also taught at other colleges as well as at Great Discourses, which is an online provider of high-quality, non-credit courses. He has written on the dialogues of Plato, the philosophy of the French Enlightenment, game theory, economics, and paradox. His non-academic activities include chess, acting, musical performance, and sports. David holds a PhD in philosophy from Pacific Miramar University, and he has a special interest in classics, especially classical philosophy. All right, now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand things over to David. So take it away, David.
Well, thanks very much. No, I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for being here today. Hope to make it worth your while. Going to start screen sharing. Okay. There we go. So, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. I'm sure everybody here has heard of the Protestant work ethic. It's kind of become a cliched phrase, and it's been detached enough from its original formulation that I think it's worth returning to that formulation to see what it originally meant. So that's the basis of my talk today. I'm going to be really talking about the argument within the book by Max Weber, which you see here in German, but is, of course, translated The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. The book was published shortly after the turn of the last century. It established the German intellectual Weber as one of the leading intellectuals of his day. Nowadays, Max Weber's most commonly known as one of the founders of the discipline of sociology, which was a very young discipline at the time. And that's somewhat ironic because Weber didn't consider himself a sociologist until late in his life. He regarded himself mostly as a political economist. But he had a lot of academic interests, one of the most significant of which, not surprisingly, was the relationship between religion and economics. And this book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, was the first of his studies of the interaction between various religious ideas and economics. His subsequent studies included titles such as The Religion of China, Confucianism and Taoism, The Religion of India, The Sociology of Hinduism and Buddhism, and Ancient Judaism. He taught at several European universities before his premature death in 1920 at the age of 56. It's speculated he may have been a victim of the Spanish flu, but that's not known. So this is another picture of Weber. Noah had one in the pre-lecture part of this that you noticed. Fairly severe looking gentleman, born 1864, died 1920. So Weber begins the first chapter of the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism with the observation that in his day, as 19th century was turning into the 20th, it was evident that a glance at the occupational statistics of any country of mixed religious composition brings to light with remarkable frequency the fact that business leaders and owners of capital, as well as the higher grades of skilled labor, and even more, the higher technically and commercially trained personnel of modern enterprises, are overwhelmingly Protestant. And at the bottom of each of the quotations from Weber, I'm having PESC, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and giving you the page number in the standard edition of this. If I don't indicate the name of someone for who the quote belongs, it's from Weber, which I'm going to do quite a bit so you can see some of these quotes and kind of keep track of what he's saying. So the consequence of this fact about occupational statistics was that societies that had a majority of Protestants had more developed capitalist economies than those that didn't. And Weber's study was an investigation of some of the causes of that phenomenon. So before we get into the argument, I want to take a quick look at the historical background. In feudal Europe under feudalism, the Middle Ages, before capitalism took hold on a widespread scale, trade, monetary trade particularly, was generally regarded with moral disapproval. Money lenders were socially marginalized, sometimes to the point of being ostracized by mainstream society. At the center of this practice was the Catholic Church, which, following a long line of pre-Christian thinkers and leaders and thinkers from Moses to Aristotle and beyond, had castigated the sin of avarice, meaning greed or excessive greed. A Catholic who indulged in usury, meaning one who received any interest from the lending of money, was in danger of being denied the sacraments and thus barred from God's kingdom. With respect to money making more generally, the great 13th century Catholic philosopher theologian St. Thomas Aquinas referred to it, money making, as turpidudo, right, which means turpitude, effectively meaning depravity, it's depraved practice. Although he somewhat grudgingly acknowledged that it was necessary at times in order for society to function. Aquinas's view is consistent with the prevailing attitude of his age, which is that while money was necessary, making more than a modest amount of it was morally and religiously perilous. Money wasn't needed for most transactions. We could get into that a little bit later. The people who most enthusiastically furthered the spirit of trade, as was noticed long before Weber's time, did so following the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. That trend was especially pronounced among the disciples of Calvinism and the Calvinist-related sects, such as the Puritans of England. That seems counterintuitive, since those religions prescribed extreme self-discipline and abstention from self-indulgence of any sort. Weber calls movements like Calvinism and Puritanism ascetic. He then asks whether there's some relationship between Protestant asceticism, this severe moral code, and abstention from self-indulgence, and the subsequent rise of capitalism. He allows that the connection between the two might be explicable partly on the basis of historical circumstances that predated the birth of either capitalism or Protestantism, but he also notes enough exceptions to those circumstances to conclude that there must have been some sort of causal link between Protestantism and capitalism. Weber then goes on to point out the irony that's going to be the centerpiece of his entire study. Religious devotion, he contends, is usually accompanied by some sort of rejection, or at least acute skepticism about worldly affairs, including the pursuit of wealth and the accumulation of possessions. Calvinism and its offspring, such as Puritanism, were the strictest and most hostile of any of the fledgling Protestant faiths to social progress of that sort. And yet, ironically, they turned out to be the most effective in promoting what Weber calls the spirit of capitalism, thus the title of the book. In order to understand what Weber means by the spirit of capitalism, we first need to understand what he means by capitalism. As he states rather emphatically, capitalism is not at all the same as mere greed. Here's what he writes. The impulse to acquisition, pursuit of gain, of money, or of the greatest possible amount of money, has in itself nothing to do with capitalism. This impulse exists and has existed among, and he's got this laundry list here, waiters, physicians, coachmen, artists, prostitutes, dishonest officials, soldiers, nobles, crusaders, gamblers, and beggars. One may say it's been common to all sorts and conditions of men at all times and in all countries of the earth. Capitalism, Weber tells us, is a specific kind of pursuit of gain, namely the pursuit of profit and ever-renewed profit by means of continuous, rational, capitalistic enterprise. The pursuit of profit and ever-renewed profit by means of continuous, rational, capitalistic enterprise. So what does he mean by rational? Well, he means that the enterprise involves planned calculation and efficiency, right? This isn't about bank robbery, right? This is something that's continuous. You make the money, you plow it back into the business. Capitalist enterprise can be primitive or sophisticated, but in all cases, it involves, quote, an actual adaptation of economic action to a comparison of money income with money expenses. Okay? The development of capitalism over time came to involve, and again, these are brief quotes, but I kind of want to give them without putting everything on the board. It came to involve, quote, a calculable legal system. This calculable business is really important. And administration in terms of formal rules, which is to say, increasing rational capitalistic enterprise for the sake of monetary gain and continuous monetary gain. So, having established this definition of capitalism, Weber introduces the term, the spirit of capitalism. He states that he's going to use the expression, I use the expression spirit of capitalism for that attitude which, in the pursuit of a calling, strives systematically for profit for its own sake. I'll be talking later about what a calling is, because it's really important, and Weber also brings it in later on. But at this early stage in the book, he illustrates what he means by the spirit of capitalism by referring to a document that he believes contains it, expresses it in what he calls almost classical purity. Maybe not too surprisingly, this is from the writings of Ben Franklin. And it's from a 1748 essay entitled Advice to a Young Tradesman. There's gentle Ben, and I'm going to read this. Remember that time is money. He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor and goes abroad or sits idle one half of that day, though he spends but 6 pence during his diversion or idleness, ought not to reckon that the only expense. He has really spent, or rather thrown away, 5 shillings besides. Remember that money is the prolific generating nature. Money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more, and so on. 5 shillings is turned as 6, turned again as 7 and 3 pence, and so on till it becomes 100 pounds. The more there is of it, the more it produces every turning, so that the profits rise quicker and quicker. He that kills a breeding sow destroys all her offspring to the 1,000th generation. He that murders a crown, that's a English monetary unit, destroys all that it might have produced, even scores of pounds. The entire passage from Franklin that Weber quotes here actually is quite a bit longer, but this fragment, I think, should be sufficient for our purposes. Weber notes here that Franklin's philosophy is not one of mere greed. Rather, it's a case for the moral as well as the practical virtues of making money. This, I think, this should be evident from the general tone of the fragment, as well as Franklin's use of terms such as idleness and thrown away as negative, which occur throughout his writings on the subject. And his other favorites include words like frugality and industry, which clearly have a positive moral tenor for Franklin. In short, Franklin invokes and espouses what Weber calls the spirit of capitalism, a definite standard of life claiming ethical sanction. Weber points out that Franklin's language is free from all direct relationship to religion. The general sense of Franklin's message could easily be referred to biblical passages like the parable of the talents in the accounts of Matthew and Luke in the Gospels, but that's not how Franklin frames it or defends it. This is an important methodological point because it means that Franklin's statements can stand for the spirit of capitalism in a manner that allows its relationship to religion to be explored without it already having been explicitly assumed. That is to say, Weber wants to draw a link between religious values and the spirit of capitalism that doesn't depend on the spirit of capitalism being fundamentally dependent upon religious values. Weber points out that the capitalist enterprise is not limited to the period directly following the Protestant Reformation or even to Western culture in general. As he writes, capitalistic acquisition as an adventure has been at home in all types of economic society which have known trade with the use of money. Individual people could and did undertake capitalist enterprises in non-capitalist societies, including pre-capitalist societies. However, people like that, Weber calls them heroic entrepreneurs, do not by themselves represent a society-wide capitalist economic order. The growth of capitalism into a major social movement required much more comprehensive support, which, according to Weber, means that the spirit of capitalism needed to be adopted on a scale well beyond the reach of a few heroic entrepreneurs. This is relevant to, for example, the differences Weber notes between Jewish and Protestant orientations to capitalism. While Jews in the post-Reformation period often embarked on what Weber calls speculatively oriented adventurous capitalism, Puritans, he claims, went much further in effectively sanctioning, quote, the ethos of rational organization of capital and labor, which is the spirit of capitalism. So Weber's well aware that a term as seemingly abstract or ethereal as the spirit of capitalism might be viewed as pretty unscientific. So he illustrates what he means by it by describing a problem that ascribing capitalist entrepreneurs commonly face when they were trying to induce laborers in pre-capitalist societies to do more work so that they, the capitalists, could make more money. Okay, so labor itself is necessary, of course, because people have always had to work in order to provide for themselves and their families. But that doesn't necessarily result in a work ethic, only in the recognition that work is necessary for survival. So entrepreneurs of this sort, pre-capitalist societies, would try to encourage workers to work longer hours by offering higher wages, with the hope that those laborers would view the extra time spent working as more profitable and would therefore engage in it longer. However, in pre-capitalist societies, this almost always resulted in laborers spending less time at work. They opted to earn the same amount of money as before while spending less time working, so it gave them more time for other things. Weber discusses this phenomenon in order to show that there's nothing natural about the sorts of virtues extolled by Ben Franklin. Here's what he writes. A man does not by nature wish to earn more and more money, but simply to live as he's accustomed to live and earn as much as is necessary for that purpose. To add to the dilemma faced by ambitious entrepreneurs in non-capitalist societies, efforts to increase productivity by the opposite means, that is, by lowering wages, also failed. This happened primarily because, in Weber's words, quote, the efficiency of labor decreases with a wage that is physiologically insufficient, which basically means it's hard to engage fully in labor or anything else when you're practically starving. So in order for capitalism to flourish, large numbers of people needed to adjust their priorities so to make the earning of money paramount. They needed, in short, to adopt and internalize what Weber calls the spirit of capitalism. So Weber introduces the term traditionalism to denote, among other things, indifference toward money-making as a worthy goal. This is what he means by a man does not by nature wish to earn more and more money. He calls that the traditionalist approach. He contrasts that with the spirit of capitalism, which would eventually overcome it in many societies. He clearly regards traditionalism as a widespread ethos in itself, applicable to almost everyone in pre-capitalist society, not only the laborers. The employing classes also typically engaged in a relatively relaxed lifestyle, feeling no obligation to increase their business or turn most of their profits back to it. Like their workers, most employers work to their desired level of material comfort and not much beyond that. They too had not yet internalized the spirit of capitalism. While most Western societies have operated on the basis of the spirit of capitalism for centuries, some exceptions still exist. Just as heroic entrepreneurs could be found in pre-capitalist and non-capitalist societies, the opposite phenomenon can also occur. To give an illustration of this, I'm going to cite an example from my personal experience. It's certainly not the best one, but I hope it'll serve to make the point. For many years, there was a bread shop on a side street in East Oxford in southern England, where I lived for some time. The shop was actually a room just beyond the front door of a private house. You could see the shop through the front window. The homeowner proprietor baked rolls, pastries, and bread every morning, then sold them to whoever showed up at her door. She opened her shop whenever she felt like it, as far as I could tell, usually around 10 a.m. It would be good to arrive a little after that so that it'd be open, but not too much after so that she'd still be selling them. She closed her doors when all the goods were sold, or she just felt like not working anymore. Her husband lived with her. He apparently didn't work except to help her out occasionally. And they lived a quiet and modest life, as you might imagine. While it might be said rather loosely that that woman's considerable baking abilities constituted her calling in life, and I'll talk more about calling as we go along, her attitude clearly did not reflect in any way the spirit of capitalism. It might be instructive for us to contrast that orientation to work and money making with that of the stereotypical father/breadwinner of my youth, who worked long hours and often had an insufficiently close relationship with his wife and kids, which he might well have come to regret later in life. You can still see vestiges of what Weber called traditionalism on a wider scale than, a bread maker in Oxford, in places like Fiji and some of the Caribbean islands. Whether or not the way of life that Weber calls traditional is more natural than life governed by the spirit of capitalism, as he appears to have believed, it was very much the status quo throughout the world for centuries. Combining this fact with the antipathy of traditional Western religion toward the acquisition of money, the question for Weber now becomes this. Now, how could activity, which was at best ethically tolerated, turn into a calling in the sense of Benjamin Franklin? So, now, after having defined capitalism and the spirit of capitalism, Weber needs to talk about what a calling is. The first thing he says about it is that it was originally a religious conception, that of a task set by God. He observes that neither Catholics nor the pagans of classical antiquity had any such concept, but that it's existed for all predominantly Protestant peoples, as we hear in statements such as, "I've been called to a life of service," or something of that sort. The word in its religious meaning, as signifying fulfillment of obligations set forth by God for each individual person, appears to have originated in the works of Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation, some 500 years ago. Luther translates a verse from the Jewish wisdom book Ecclesiasticus. This is chapter 11, verse 21, if you're following along with your Bible. And it says this: "Trust in the Lord and abide in thy calling." The Hebrew word that Luther translates as calling is rendered as labor in the King James Version, abide in thy labor, and as toil in other translations. And I understand those words are more literally accurate than calling. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I don't know that, but that's generally accepted. But in Luther's theology, the notion of a calling, a divinely given means of serving God through one's labor, becomes paramount. Elsewhere, Luther writes in lectures on the book of Genesis, "God accomplishes all things through you. Through you, he milks the cow and does the most servile works." This sort of statement typifies Luther's conception of the calling as referring to that which God has called us to do in the world on his behalf. Now, as Weber notes, Luther himself would have strenuously rejected any connection between an individual's duty to labor and a calling and the spirit of capitalism, had that spirit even existed in Luther's time. Luther regarded the calling as that which a person needs to accept as a divine decree, so that work in the world on God's behalf could in no way be equated with capitalism, much less making as much money as possible. On Weber's account, though, it's not that there's no relation between Luther's conception of the calling and the emerging of the spirit of capitalism, but rather that the relationship can't be derived directly, and it certainly has nothing at all to do with Luther's intentions. But his idea of the calling was, in Weber's view, the first step toward the development of that relationship. The relationship between the calling and the spirit of capitalism becomes clearer in the works of Luther's successor, John Calvin, the founder, of course, of Calvinism. This is due, perhaps surprisingly, to a crucial difference in their respective beliefs about predestination. Luther had stated that some people are preordained by God for salvation, the references to the elect in the New Testament, but he categorically and vociferously rejected the idea that everyone who isn't preordained is destined for hell. If you believe that, Luther thought, then Jesus's pilgrim to the earth made no sense. He couldn't save any souls because the question of each individual's salvation would have already been decided. But Calvin saw it differently. As he said, some men and angels, he had angels in there too, are predestined unto everlasting life, and others foreordained to everlasting death. Calvin believed that the gulf between gods and men, and even gods and angels, was so great that human will was irrelevant. Only God had will. God predestined all of this. So the fortunate ones, human beings will ascend to heaven. And that's not going to be because of any virtue that we have. Because due to original sin, we don't have any. It would only come through God's grace. Furthermore, according to Calvin, original sin prevents us from even knowing whether we're among the elect. It's all been preordained, but we don't know. God has therefore given all human beings what Calvin terms an effectual calling, so using Luther's term, by which they're meant to manifest God's glory in their actions in the world. So Weber's next step is to investigate what he calls the influence of those psychological sanctions which, originating in religious belief in the practice of religion, gave a direction to practical conduct and held the individual to it. In other words, what does this whole doctrine have to do in its effect on the psyches of the believers, of the Calvinists? So his question concerns the doctrines prescribed by Calvinism, which, regardless of their intended purpose, eventually led its followers to adopt modes of conduct that were favorable to the growth of capitalism. Okay, before considering Weber's response to this question, we need to remind ourselves that salvation was the critical issue for the individual Christian. The Roman Catholic Church had promised salvation to those who accepted the Church's sacraments and submitted to clerical authority, but the Protestant Reformation had removed all such assurances. Luther and his followers regarded such practices as pernicious and as non-scriptural inventions of the Catholic Church. All the stuff about indulgences, sacraments, they just found this, even the notion that priests were speaking on behalf of God, all this was anathema to Luther at the point when he left the church in the early 16th century. So from a psychological viewpoint, the viewpoint that's most important to Weber here, Protestants had to adjust to this change in a manner that would allow them to achieve salvation. But of course, there was no manner that would allow them to achieve salvation because, according to Calvin, there was nothing we could do to influence God's judgment, which had already been made. So then the question becomes, what could they do that would allow them to know whether they were saved? Calvin taught his followers to consider it an absolute duty to believe that they were among the elect, that they were chosen for salvation, and to dispel any doubts about it, so that lack of self-confidence itself became evidence of insufficient faith and thus was a sure sign of damnation. So how is such assurance to be provided? Well, Calvin offered two possibilities. The first was inward experience, which he often referred to as conscience. You just know it internally. And the other was outward productivity and a calling. Calvin emphasized the former approach, conscience, but the latter became more important in practice. That is, work within a calling. And according to Weber, there were good reasons for that. For all of Luther's talk of how one should live in the world, Lutheran piety remained similar to Catholicism in its emphasis on the blessings of a mystical union with God. This is why Luther is not in any way really directly connected to the spirit of capitalism. But Calvin considered the gulf between God and human beings to be so great that any claims we might have about having achieved mystical union with God were regarded with extreme suspicion. As a result, inward experience gradually came to be regarded as a less certain sign of election, of salvation, than outward productivity and a calling. So if one's outwardly productive in a calling, what's going to happen? Well, they'll achieve worldly success. So, as self-confidence took the place of priestly assurance of God's grace under Catholicism, worldly success became the surest indicator of that self-confidence. So, Calvinist doctrine ultimately came to mean in practice that the surest way of knowing that one was bound for heaven was to engage in Christian conduct which served to increase the glory of God. And that conduct, most importantly, emphasized labor within a calling. Now, this is still, of course, far removed from the virtues extolled by the non-Christian Ben Franklin that I referred to earlier. Weber called Franklin in one place a colorless deist, right? Someone you believed you needed a God to set the world in motion, but by no means a Christian. But the practical outcome of the tenets of Christianity, of ascetic Christianity, particularly, and Calvinism, particularly, was, to borrow Franklin's words, as Weber does, God helps those who help themselves. In this respect, the Protestant view was decisively different from the Catholic one. Weber calls the Catholic approach an ethic of intentions. A Catholic could sin, repent, and continue on the road to salvation. Calvinists, however, were exhorted to live according to Jesus' dictum in the Gospel of St. Matthew, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." It's from the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, verse 48. According to Weber, the Protestant ethic effectively substituted for the spiritual aristocracy of monks outside of and above the world, the spiritual aristocracy of the predestined saints within the world. So work and a calling becomes an increasingly widespread practice. And that work leads to an increase in earnings for those who practice it. And as a result, money-making inevitably sheds the condemnation that had been traditionally attached to it. And this too can be partly attributed to Calvin's influences, in some ways more directly than what we've said so far. He gave moral sanction to the profit motive for the first time in the history of Christianity, although in an extremely limited way, in his 134th Sermon on the Pentateuch, which is commonly referred to as Calvin's Sermon on Usury. In discussing chapter 23, verse 19 of the book of Deuteronomy, in which it stated, quote, "Thou shalt not give usury to thy brother," Calvin tries to deconstruct this. What does this actually mean? And he argues stridently against profiting from the lending of money. But then he says this, "But now some man will demand whether all manner of profit be forbidden by lending. And it were a thing worth the discussing." It takes a little while to get used to the way he writes. "For put the case that a man dealeth plainly and delivereth his ware at a price and for a time. If the other break day with him and delay him of his money, doubtless he desireth to pay the forfeiture or the profit which he withholdeth from he who made the loan. And when the interest or gain is set by justice," by which he meant law, "surely he needeth not make any conscience to take it. There is a man which hath taken my commodity, whereby I must live. For when I have sold today, I buy again tomorrow. And therefore he that hindereth me, by withholding from me the gain of my commodity, from maintaining the trade of my shop, he doth no better than cut my throat. For behold, I grounded myself upon him. He promised to pay me at such a day. That time is past, and I can get nothing from him of him. He cares not though I and my family starve from hunger." Okay, so let's be clear what Calvin's saying here. This is not a widespread countenance of let's charge interest all over the place. It's the one and only case he mentions in which the recovery of a loan is permitted. And it's when the debtor delays paying his debts and the law allows the payment of interest. There are no other circumstances in this lecture or any other that sermon, or any other I'm familiar with, where Calvin allows for the practice of profit making. And at the time, usury referred to receiving any interest at all from money lending, not excessive interest as it came to mean later on. Elsewhere in the sermon, moneylenders are informed they have to offer loans to the poor without any expectation of return, that a borrower must reap as much advantage from each transaction as a lender, that no one is allowed to profit monetarily at the expense of his neighbor, and so on. It's beyond all doubt that Calvin intended this sermon as a vociferous attack on usury, not as a defense of it. But the loan exception he allows is far removed from the Catholic notion that those who practice money lending in any circumstances may be denied the sacraments and are thus in danger of being excluded from the kingdom of God. Calvin wasn't alone in sanctioning usury in certain circumstances in that period of history. To take one example, his contemporary, King Henry VIII of England, who I doubt Calvin would have regarded very highly, permitted it in restricted circumstances in the latter years of his reign. More broadly speaking, the trend toward qualified approval of some forms of money-making was also evidenced in other Protestant sects of that period. Any sect that emphasized Christian asceticism, again, strict regulation of one's life in accordance with religious precepts, strong self-discipline, and so forth, provided fertile soil for the development of capitalism, even when their precepts were intended very differently. For example, this trend was also true of the early Quakers. That might seem startling, given how different the Quakers were from other ascetic Protestant sects, even in their origins, and certainly in their development in the centuries since then. But when we look at the great commercial successes of Quakers in the United Kingdom, and enterprises such as Cadbury Chocolate Products and the Barclays and Lloyds Banks, which have existed forever and still do, we can see that a connection is there to be made. And that connection was explicitly made by the British Quaker Joseph Rowntree a century after Ben Franklin. Here's what Rowntree had to say. Is it merely a coincidence, or is it a consequence that the lofty profession of spirituality made by the Friends, Quakers, as you may know, Quakers and Friends are interchangeable terms, has gone hand in hand with shrewdness and tact in the transaction of mundane affairs? Real piety favors the success of the trader by ensuring his integrity and fostering habits of prudence and forethought, important items in obtaining that standing and credit in the commercial world, which are requisite for the steady accumulation of wealth. Weber goes on to explain further how the ascetic branches of post-Reformation Christianity inadvertently supported the spirit of capitalism. Most tellingly, he highlights the contrast between the Catholic and Protestant orientations to life on earth. He does this in a few ways, including with a brief reference to classical works of literature, which, of course, as a basic program instructor, is something that I'm particularly drawn to. And this is a particularly pithy one, I think. He notes that the Catholic Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy ends in Paradiso with the protagonist transfixed and enraptured by the mystical vision of God in heaven, while the Protestant John Milton's Paradise Lost ends with Adam and Eve leaving one spot on earth to undertake labor at a different one. But more tellingly, Weber references Orthodox theology, contrasting the writings of the Catholic Aquinas with those of the preeminent 17th century writer on Puritan ethics, the Englishman Richard Baxter. Baxter, like Calvin and other post-Reformation Christians, emphasized that the accumulation of wealth leads to numerous unchristian temptations and therefore risks one's salvation. Sounds Catholic, but close examination of Baxter's works, according to Weber, leads one to a better understanding of the irony, the Weberian irony, that this sort of doctrine could and actually did support the accumulation of wealth. The ethical objection of Baxter and his ilk to money-making is not to material gain, but to the possibility that the security that material gain offers could tempt its owner to abandon pursuit of a righteous life. Money-making itself is not criticized. In fact, it's approved of, and often even glorified. Here's something Baxter writes. When God shows you a way in which you can lawfully make more money without danger to your soul or to others than you can in some other way, and when you reject this way and follow the way that brings in less, then you cross one of the purposes of your calling. You refuse to be God's steward and to accept his gifts. According to Baxter, such refusal is a sign that the person in question is not one of God's elect. Therefore, one must work ceaselessly, a point that Baxter defends by means of the scriptural passage, "He who will not work shall not eat." That's from Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 3, verse 10. In Baxter's view, every hour of relaxation is an hour that's been lost to laboring for the glory of God. The Catholic Aquinas sees this matter much differently. Labor, Aquinas writes, is required only insofar as it's necessary for the preservation of the community. Any individual can live without laboring is more than welcome to do so, preferably in order to undertake spiritual contemplation. This is the meaning of, and the consequence of the gospel story of Mary and Martha, Mary the contemplative, Martha the laborer, in Luke chapter 10, verse 42, which concludes with Jesus telling the sisters that Mary has the better part. But for Baxter and other ascetic Protestants, the notions that there are higher occupations than labor within a calling was Satan's argument, not God's. For Baxter, as well as for Calvin, the key element in this system was not just labor, but labor within a calling. As Baxter put it, outside of a well-marked calling, the accomplishments of a man are only casual and irregular, and he spends more time in idleness than in work. Therefore, a certain calling is best for everyone. The parable of the talents I mentioned earlier from Matthew chapter 25, in which a man entrusts his servants with money and praises those who use it to increase his wealth, is taken by Baxter to mean that a faithful Christian must take any opportunity to make money. Wealth can be a vice, but not in itself, only if it leads to idleness and sinful enjoyment of life. But it's to be commended when it results from the performance of one's duty in a calling, and when that duty continues to be scrupulously observed. In fact, it was regularly argued by Baxter's contemporaries that wishing to be poor, as in the vow taken by cloistered Catholics, was as absurd as wishing to be sick. So no longer was the Christian orientation to wealth informed by Paul's words in his first letter to Timothy, chapter 6, verse 8. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. Money began to be viewed as a sign that God was with the moneymaker, as proof of his success in a calling. Again, we should bear in mind that Protestant asceticism was strident in arguing against unnecessary consumption and the mere hoarding of wealth. Baxter put it this way: you may choose to be rich for God, but not for the flesh and for sin. The pursuit of worldly goods as an end in itself was condemned, serving as a virtue only insofar as it was the result of labor within a calling, and thus a sign of one's eternal salvation. But in Weber's words, again, the psychological aspects of this was that the benefits of making money, as Baxter and others put them, freed the notion of the acquisition of goods from the inhibitions of traditionalistic ethics, which said that money making is bad, or at least seriously suspect. As Weber put it, the religious valuation of restless, continuous, systematic work in a worldly calling is the highest means to asceticism, and at the same time, the surest and most evident proof of rebirth and genuine faith, must have been the most powerful conceivable lever for the expansion of that attitude toward life, that we have here called the spirit of capitalism. And then the fruits of that spirit of capitalism would turn out, ironically, to produce society-wide results far, far from the ones envisioned by Catholics and other ascetic Protestants. And that wasn't that they didn't foresee the danger. Baxter foresaw it clearly, and the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, saw it even more clearly. I'll read you a passage from Wesley. It's a little too long to put up here, but it's really helpful on this ground. Here's what Wesley had to say in one of his sermons. I fear whenever riches have increased, religion has declined in the same proportion. Therefore, I do not see how it's possible in the nature of things for any revival of true religion to continue long. For religion must produce both industry and frugality, and these cannot but produce riches. But as riches increase, so will pride, anger, and love in the world in all its branches. We ought not to prevent people from being diligent and frugal. We must exert all Christians to gain all they can and to save all they can. That is, in effect, to grow rich. What way can we then take that our money-making may not sink us to the nethermost hell? There's one way and no other under heaven. If they that gain all they can and save all they can will also give away all that they can, the more they gain, the more they will grow in grace, and the more treasure they will lay up in heaven. And here's a snippet from one of Wesley's last sermons along the same lines. With this one is actually quoted in Weber, but again, I think relevant. Here's what Wesley said. It's about a year before he died. After you have gained all you can and saved all you can, spend not 1 pound, 1 shilling, 1 penny to gratify either the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, or the pride of life, or for any other end than to please and glorify God. I defy all men upon earth, yea, all angels in heaven, to find any other way to extract the person from the riches. Wesley's foresight was noteworthy. He clearly foresaw the possibility that ascetic Christianity could become endangered merely by carrying out its own principles. But stern sermons on the subject proved insufficient to prevent Protestant asceticism from being transformed into the spirit of capitalism. Weber concluded that the new religious sects had, in effect, consecrated money-making, so that the making of money became consistent with virtue, and thus could be undertaken with a clear conscience. Of course, by the time Weber wrote at the turn of the last century, capitalist economics had been operating for centuries. The spirit of capitalism had long since shed its religious roots, and had largely done so even by the time of Ben Franklin. As a result, the calling eventually became converted into the career. As Weber wrote, capitalism no longer needs the support of any religious forces and feels the attempts of religion to influence economic life, insofar as they can still be felt at all, to be as much an unjustified interference as its regulation by the state. In other words, laissez-faire economics was threatened not only by state regulation, but also by religious strictures by the time of Weber. Rather, the capitalistic economy of the present day is an immense cosmos into which the individual is born and which presents itself to him, at least as an individual, as an unalterable order of things in which he must live. So here Weber makes clear that any reference to the Protestant work ethic in the 20th or 21st centuries, or even earlier, doesn't have anything to do anymore with acceptance of the religious precepts of age-old Protestantism. If anything, it's contrary to them. We could see some traces of this, of that relationship, that old relationship in certain places. The prosperity gospel movement has something to say about that. But generally speaking, capitalism no longer needs any sort of religious justification to continue to flourish. As Weber saw it, there's no reason why the forces that generate social and economic transformation, such as Calvinism, Puritanism, Quakerism, and so forth, should be needed to sustain those changes once they've reached a substantial degree of society-wide acceptance. So, okay, let's briefly summarize the argument. Okay, according to the early Protestant religions, an individual is obligated to follow a vocation faithfully, even obsessively. Okay, secondly, a person living in this way was more likely to accumulate money than one who was not. 3, the early Protestant religions, especially the ascetic ones, therefore indirectly encouraged and even consecrated money-making. 4, the consecration of money-making resulted in the proliferation of the spirit of capitalism. And finally, over time, the spirit of capitalism became less and less dependent upon its religious roots, eventually breaking free of them altogether. So this concludes Weber's investigation of the subject. But I also want to mention the conclusion of his book. Earlier, he'd noted that his study was academic, not evaluative. But his rigorously scholarly tone changes dramatically in the book's final pages, in which he laments that the loss of any religious underpinning to the spirit of capitalism has led to a kind of involuntary servitude to mechanized industry. The Puritan wanted to work in a calling, Weber says. We are forced to do so. For when asceticism was carried out of monastic cells into everyday life and began to dominate worldly morality, it did its part in building the tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order. This order is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which today determine the lives of all individuals, who are born into this mechanism. Not only those directly concerned with economic acquisition, with irresistible force. Perhaps it will so determine them until the last ton of fossilized coal is burnt. In Baxter's view, the care for external goods should only lie on the shoulders of the saint like a light cloak, which can be thrown aside at any moment. But fate decreed that the cloak should become an iron cage. In case the references to irresistible force and iron cage don't come across as sufficiently derogatory, I want to give you a quote that Weber quotes with obvious approval. They're from the polymath Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the great 18th, 19th century writer, predecessor by a century of Weber, who a century before Weber had deemed the new capitalists, quote, sensualists without spirit, sensualists without heart. This nullity, this nothing, imagines it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved, unquote. Weber's extreme distaste for capitalism becomes evident here. But he ends this diatribe as abruptly as he started it, quickly noting that, quote, this brings us to the world of judgments of value and of faith, with which this purely historical discussion need not be burdened, unquote. After briefly sketching the next steps that historians would need to take in order to assess the broader cultural significance of ascetic Protestantism, Weber concludes this book with a final passage about the method, the social scientific method, which led him to introduce the spirit of capitalism as a causal force. He writes this: it is, of course, not my intention to substitute for a one-sided materialistic and equally one-sided spiritualistic causal interpretation of culture and history. Each is equally possible, but each, if it does not serve as the preparation, but as the conclusion of investigation, accomplishes equally little in the interest of historical truth. So what Weber's saying here is that one might see this spirit of capitalism as being spiritualistic, psychological, intellectual. How do ideas influence things? And they might say, well, that can't be the only cause. And Weber says, of course it's not the only cause. I'm not trying to substitute one-sided materialism with one-sided spiritualism. But in this passage, Weber is also acknowledging, in effect, that his work serves as a counterpoint to the economic determinism of Karl Marx. And that's what he's referring to primarily when he talks about a one-sided materialistic causal interpretation of culture and history. As Marx and Friedrich Engels famously wrote in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of the ruling class. Marx believed that all ideas, including spiritual ones, are mere epiphenomena, byproducts, rationalizations that are promulgated by the ruling classes based on their class interests, so that a non-materialistic concept such as the spirit of capitalism can never truly be the cause of anything. I expect it's clear by now that Weber flatly rejects Marx's view. He assures his readers that he regards economic factors as extremely important, but he also believes that such factors can never completely explain any significant social phenomenon. Furthermore, he holds, also in opposition to Marx, that any account of large-scale events must necessarily be limited and partial, because we ourselves are limited and partial. And this is also true of the views of any historical actor. That explains why Weber believes that the results of any endeavor, including John Calvin's, can result in consequences that are far different from those that are intended. On Weber's account, historical irony is very real, and studies like this one can show us how and why it happens. Indeed, if there's a moral to the story that Weber tells us in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, it might be a surprisingly commonplace one. Be careful what you wish for. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. So I've been sending messages to our Zoom audience who is present that if you would like me to put a question to David, you should enter it into the chat. That still goes. If you miss those messages in the chat, I'll say them out loud. I have 3 questions at the moment from our audience, but if anyone would like to add some, please enter your questions into the chat. So the first question I have for you, David, comes from Charles Fout. Question is, does this Protestant work ethic exist outside of North America and the UK?
Yeah, thank you. Good to see you, Charles. It exists. So in Weber's time, he was largely talking about the West. I mean, he made that clear in a lot of things, and I kind of bracketed it in what I said. His studies of the East indicate that the specific mechanisms of capitalism, that is to do things like double entry bookkeeping, credits and debits, the rationalism, it doesn't really fit with the culture of the period. But he also indicates that it increasingly does as the capitalism spreads through the world order. Obviously, the way that's worked in the last 120 years since he wrote is much greater. But he tends to see, he talks a little bit about what they used to call the Orient, but it's mostly simply to say, first of all, that there's nothing better or worse than the West, but that this analysis doesn't particularly applies to the West, and particularly to Western Europe and America, first world countries.
Thanks, David. The next question is from Ross Bagby. Question is, did Weber explore literary treatments such as Shakespeare's, yeah, I suppose that's right, contrasting the merchant Antonio and the moneylender Shylock in Merchant of Venice, or the naive generosity of Timon of Athens?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and he certainly didn't in this. In fact, the reference to Dante and Milton kind of comes out of the blue a little bit. But here he was kind of doing fairly rigorous study, which generally he was. I mean, but he certainly didn't bring that up in this work, and I'm not aware. I've read fairly extensively in Weber, and I'm not aware of him mentioning that in other works as well. I mean, he would occasionally bring a literary reference, like he did sort of with Goethe and what I mentioned, but usually it was kind of a throwaway line as the one about Dante and Milton was. That's a great question, Ross.
Thanks, David. Our next question is from Jeffrey Bergman. Question is, so it starts with a statement. John Wesley's explanation of the cycle of faith, industry, wealth, pride, irreligion seems to recall the classical cycle of forms of government, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, tyranny. Is there a connection between these cycles?
I'll get back to you in about an hour. No, let me think about that. It's quite a complex question. Okay, so in other words, right. So you have in, let's say, the classical accounts, particularly I'm thinking of Plato's Republic, books 8 and 9, about the decline of civilizations. You have each civilization, each political order, you could say, having the seeds of its own decline within it, which I think maybe is the connection that Jeff's making there. Yeah, I mean, certainly it's not anything that Weber does. I guess um, there's something in it that is probably indicative of consequences that occur that are certainly not the ones intended by those who espoused the things that led to them. In Plato's view, while there's ironies, I guess you could say, there's also kind of a linear progression in which the seeds can fairly clearly be seen by someone who's perceptive in what's going to happen. While I don't think Weber would have thought in that way, that one could have looked at the state of the Western world in, say, 1600 and said, oh, yes, we're due for this because Protestant asceticism is going to lead in this direction. Probably that could only be looked at retrospectively. But it's fascinating question. But I think we would have to make that connection ourselves. It's kind of the kind of connection you'd make in a basic program class and then play with and say, oh, does that really work? And of course, if you contrast Weber with Marx, then of course that's where maybe the connection gets tighter between Weber and these classical comparisons of the decline of civilizations, because Marx, of course, has an entirely different account, and the account doesn't necessarily have to do with decline.
David, I'm going to follow up on this. Either in fact or in Weber's portrayal of him, does it seem like John Wesley exercises any foresight along these lines rather than just a spotting of the cycle retrospectively, from faith, industry to wealth to pride to irreligion?
Wesley's writing considerably, I'm not sure. I haven't read that much of Wesley. Wesley's writing considerably after Baxter, and it seems as though the things that Baxter is clearly aware of tend to be somewhat abstract, like, oh, these are temptations, right? And Wesley seeing it as this is what's actually happening, right? I mean, the church is really at risk for this. I think the stridency with which Wesley writes toward the end of his life is just very different. So I've read it from Baxter's. Baxter's just, yeah, you shouldn't do this because this isn't what God wants. And this could be a problem. For Wesley, it's more, the entire decline of the church could occur on the basis of this. And we have to be preaching pious use of money for this, or we're going to disappear. And, from my perspective, he was pretty much prescient about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's a much more modest kind of foresight than what you might see as something like an insight, for instance, on Socrates' behalf into the seeds of the destruction of any regime long before it seems to falter, or its values long before it seems to falter.
Right.
Wesley seeing what's happening and saying, "This is where we're headed. It's imminent."
I think so. I mean, I don't know the Earl well enough, but it just seems as if Wesley has contemporary, that he's seeing something that isn't just like, well, this is like the temptations of Christ in the desert. It's like, here's what's really going to happen. And it's not surprising. I mean, everyone in his flock is not going to be giving all their money to charity. It's something you can see that people have to be warned about, that doing God's will means doing God's will. And accumulation of wealth that isn't saved for some pious purpose or given away is just contrary to it. For that to happen, you've got to have basically everyone coming to church all the time and being assured that their salvation depends on it, at a time when salvation is more important than making money. And as that erodes, as it has, now, I would say for centuries, that just becomes a harder case to make.
Thanks, David. Oh, very interesting.
No, thanks, Noah. That's great.
Their next question is from Ira Pilchin. The question is, did Weber or other contemporaries comment on the assignment of money lending to segregated Jewish communities and its contribution to anti-Semitic attitudes and practices?
You know, I'm guessing that in his book on Judaism, which the three books I mentioned that were later ones that he wrote, I'm guessing that he did that. But here he only does it in a sort of a scientific way. One of the things he indicates early on, let me think how to put this. Basically, one of the reasons that he takes up early, I didn't really mention this because there's only so much you can say, but early when he starts talking about this phenomenon that he describes at the very beginning, that the Protestant countries are much more aligned to capitalism than Catholic ones. He says, well, there are a couple of things people might say, like, well, the Protestants have more inherited wealth, but it turns out that's true in some places, not others, and then different modes of education, but none of that is very decisive. And one of the things he says that makes his argument stronger is he says that once a established, well-formed group becomes a minority or is a minority in a society, they actually tend to be more oriented toward laboring and usually money making and possibly money lending than if they're in the domination. But this hasn't happened with the Catholics. It did happen with the Jews. Now, he doesn't make a big amount of this point, nor should he, because the Jews, of course, are generally put in Europe in positions where there's nothing else they're allowed to do. But that is an example that he kind of passingly gives. But in this work, he really only refers to it then, and then to talk about heroic entrepreneurialism kind of thing that, again, would be one of the few things that Jews would be allowed to perform, certainly in Germany. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, David. Well, that's the end of our questions from the audience, but I'm going to be greedy and ask a question of my own. It seems like, I don't know if you and Richard Hoskins, who's fortunately for the sake of this question and in general present today, arranged to have a lecture on Weber following a month earlier a lecture on Nietzsche, but I'm going to ask about a connection between them. So Nietzsche is about 20 years Weber senior, so they're about a generation apart.
Yeah.
And it seems like in the Protestant ethic, Weber is practicing something like a technique for analysis and understanding that's similar to one for which Nietzsche is quite famous and in which he pioneered in some ways, namely genealogy. He examines the historical origins of a particular set of values and attitudes, and there's an extra value for Nietzsche in doing that. I don't want to prejudge what that value is, but okay, so for Weber, what's the value of taking this genealogical approach to the spirit of capitalism? What do we see extra about it that, for instance, say a Ben Franklin couldn't see, or that we might not be able to see if we didn't know this long story about its origins in the Protestant ethic? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like asking Richard to get on with this, but maybe that's probably not what he he would be talking about. I don't know how much it would have to do with the specifics of what he's writing about. He's certainly interested in that, but there's in Weber's view, and maybe similarly to Nietzsche's, the failure to understand the entire historical context of any phenomenon is going to make your task even more partial than it would be otherwise, right? And this can't be done simply on the basis of, oh, well, these people own the means of production or the kinds of things that Marx and others, to him, those are just one-sided, not wrong, but just even more partial explanations. I think in his time, he would have seen the social sciences in their attempt to be scientific as more statistically oriented and materialistic than he really was comfortable with. That is so that part of what he does is attempt, it's not to say, oh, the spiritualistic or the psychological is more important than the material. It's to compensate for what he sees as an overemphasis in the literature about what what means to be a social science, I guess I would say. So I'm not sure I would say, so methodologically it's that. I think I really meant what I said about be careful what you wish for, although of course Weber's never that vulgar. But it also seems to me that if we're looking today at what the Protestant work ethic is, we might have a very simplistic kind of view of it. And I'm hoping that this kind of indicates, look, the Protestant work ethic is in some sense is not a product of a love match between Protestantism and capitalism. It's an irony that developed historically for unforeseeable reasons. And if that's the case, I think, and Weber, I think, would say this, judging from his other works, it is be careful what you wish for. It's like, okay, we're going to, that he would see most efforts at major social change as very cautionary, right? You can look at these and say, here's what was intended, and here's what happened, and it's a lot different. He was in general fairly conservative. It's hard to put him in a particular category that we would think of as right now of politics, but I do think that this genealogical approach is intended to unearth something that, for Nietzsche, it's kind of what's been forgotten. I mean, and for Weber, it's what's being forgotten right now in the ways that people are looking at why things are as they are.
Thanks, David. Well, we are out of time, so I'm going to have us participate in a basic program tradition. At this point, I'm going to press the Ask All to Unmute button, and I'll ask you all to unmute and thank David as if we were sitting in an auditorium with him by clapping and giving him your oral acclaim. So thank you, David.
Thank you, sir. Good seeing you.
Thank you.
Thanks you all for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everyone. Thanks for coming.